Duff, your location there, you're in education. Tell me about that role in your interesting life.
Well, um, I was born to be a teacher, I think, and one door after another opened. So I went teaching in what we call the high school, through to college teaching, and then finally university. And I came out with a PhD and also with a Bachelor of Education and no job, which is very common in Canada. And so the chance came to move out to Western Canada into the north. And so I became, as I say, an economic refugee to Alberta from Ontario. And I've been teaching university studies up here for 24 years.
My goodness, that's a while.
Yes, it is. It's just retired, actually.
Ah, a nice place to be, I suggest.
Oh, it's majestic in moments, and it will try to kill you in an unguarded moment during the winter.
And that's not
Canadian,
and that's
it
not
doesn't-
even that's not even mentioning the bears.
Yeah. Well, the best part was the bear that came down and tried to live at the college in the big garbage bin, but the police came and darted him and took him back to nature. It was very amusing because the Japanese tourists wanted to come out, and the Japanese students, of course, wanted to come out that were visiting and pet the thing. But we restrained them.
It's all good. It's all good. Now, your particular interest in the World War, the First World War. Unique and complex situation then, facing Irish Catholics in Canada around about 1916.
Oh yes, for the Irish, it was a very interesting war, but also a very heartache-aching war. In Canada, the peculiar nature of Irish migrants to Canada was that most of them who came, including the Catholics, were still in sympathy with the British Empire, and they really had faith in the idea that wartime service would produce home rule for Ireland, and so we call it the waning of the green.
Wow.
The phenomenon of Toronto Irish, for example. Mark McGowan has written a wonderful book that explains that for many of the Irish in Toronto, demonstrating their loyalty to Canada and to the Empire meant serving in World War One.
And off they went.
We have very high enlistment rates.
Yes, especially amongst the Catholics.
Yes, exactly. People expected the Irish Catholics to be more neutral, or even as they were in the United States, but that just wasn't the case.
That was those were the Irish, but the French Catholics and the Ukrainians, they weren't as enthusiastic.
Oh, there was conflict indeed. For the Irish, for the Ukrainian Catholics, they weren't even allowed to take part because they were considered enemy aliens, most of them coming from Austria. The French Canadians, of course, said this is all very wonderful for you, but our loyalties are more to Canada. It's our birthplace. We don't have a lot of love for France. I think many English Canadians assumed that French Canada would had to the cause of France in World War One, but from the point of view of most French Canadians, France was a non-starter. It had secularized, which for most Catholics in Canada who were ultramontane in sympathy meant that really France was a heretic state. And in that sense, their loyalties are much more through to Rome and to Canada, not to France. So recruiting in French Canada was very difficult, and often because the military in Canada had been unilingually English, it meant that you were quite likely to see more Scottish and Irish Catholics in the Canadian Expeditionary Force than French Roman Catholics, indeed. And when conscription came in 1917, that was over.
Yeah.
The Irish Rebellion then, or the Easter Rising, was for many Irish Canadians a conundrum because the British overreaction, the heavy cracking down, really embittered some of the Montreal Irish and placed, especially in Montreal, the Irish in a bit of a conflict of loyalties and really was a blow, and yet recruiting stayed up.
Yeah.
In Toronto, it just went by.
But in terms of Ireland, had the executions of the leaders of the rebellion not occurred, then maybe the state would not have been born as rapidly as it was.
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? And certainly the Irish attitude in Toronto was, well, this is almost a criminal element that has almost wrecked the whole thing. But the war, of course, turned out to be very different from what most people expected, as did the outcome.
Canadian chaplains, there was no shortage of good men, men of faith who wanted to be there with the fighting men of the Allies.
That's right. The enlistments were high. There weren't enough vacancies actually to take everyone, so we had a large number of clergymen who served in the ranks as officers. Not the Catholic priests, of course. The bishops wouldn't give permission for that. But of course, there were many chaplains, probably 100 Roman Catholic priests who served in the First World War in the Canadian forces alone, and some went back to Britain and to Ireland and served there.
And it was that hands-on weapons approach that the bishops would not allow. They were very happy for them to go as chaplains, but not as fighting soldiers.
That's right. It was forbidden. And so for the Catholics, the chaplaincy route meant living with the men and traveling with them. And the Canadians, and later the British, agreed that the place for the chaplain was, to use today's term, outside the wire, with the men in the line. And in the last days of the war, the Canadian chaplains went over the top with the men, carrying a stretcher in the attacking waves.
My goodness. Now, we're 100 years down the road, and lots and lots of remembrance activities occurring this side of the pond. What's happening in Canada?
Well, there was a number of events in August, a rolling continuation. The interesting thing here is that the articles, the new books, the re-edition of my book even, indicate that there's a desire to know and to understand. There's a kind of a mystery to this thing. For many Canadians, there's a kind of a mist that they look back through, and what they look through in that mist is a century of grief and mourning and rituals of mourning. That for most Canadians, World War I is this tragedy, this heroic tragedy, and it becomes a kind of precedent as well as a symbol of the risks and the costs of getting involved outside of Canada in the big world. And the cost of being a bit naive and over-enthusiastic sometimes getting involved. And you have that among Canadians, a sympathy for Great Britain and the British Empire and the war and so on, but it's got that sound almost psychologically of a bit of weeping in it. And I think for them, too, the feeling that this was a war that was tragic and a waste. So many young men cut off in the prime, and as one of our fellows said, how many future cures for cancer or great medical breakthroughs or geniuses of science or in social work would never finish their lives, much less finish the war.
Fundamentally, those soldiers who died, the Canadians who died, and the kind of genre of people going to a foreign battle across an ocean, that kind of thing didn't register all that easy in terms of understanding, a full understanding of rationale and reasons why it was occurring.
Yes, although there was a huge enthusiasm for the cause because of the way the war began, and there was a sense in Canada that this was something apocalyptic, the sinking of hospital ships and the Lusitania, and you think of the atrocity reports, and of course the war began with the breach of neutrality, which meant that people in Canada thought morally Britain was right. But as the war went on and the conflict deepened, it became an apocalyptic struggle, a kind of Armageddon where there could be no turning back. And they often use the metaphor that the person or the story that whoever puts their hand to the plow and then looks back isn't fit. And in fact, the war became a war for Kingdom of God. Canadian nationalists and Canadian churchmen agreed that the war was the transforming point in our evolution as a nation, and that the only way we could be worthy to win would be to transform Canada into a more Christian and more just nation.
The war was the crucible and made the difference.
Yeah, the crucible of our regeneration, one commentator put it at the time. Of course, what happened was the war went on, and the chaplains are looking at more and more casualties and writing more letters home, and people at home are dreading the coming of the telegraph carrier with the little yellow telegram that was used here to notify people of wounds or death. My own great-grandmother received 2 of those during the war. My grandfather was wounded, and his brother died at Passchendaele. So for most Canadians, in a country of 8 million people, when you put over 600,000 men in uniform, everybody knew someone that was overseas.
Yes, yes.
And almost everyone knew someone who was killed or wounded. And so the result then becomes a kind of, there has to be a reason for this, and it has to be a good one. The providence is good, after all, was what most Canadians have been taught. And therefore, the outcome of the war would be the coming of perhaps the kingdom of love and light, as we used to sing in church.
Do you think that occurred?
Well, of course, the problem was that the theology in Protestant churches had kind of lost grip with the of evil and had come to believe a kind of Christian evolution version. It was we call them liberal evangelicals. They all had conversion experiences, but they also believed that what the church historians and the theologians at the time were saying was that the kingdom of God would come through the work of the church. And so defeating the Germans and the Turks was a kind of a church service, a kind of mission that would
a crusade
the
even
kingdom of God on earth.
A crusade even.
Aye, yes.
A modern crusade. Now, we've all the things we have said links Canada intimately into the conflict, but to what extent, from a kind of cerebral point of view, did the Canadian people feel ownership of this war in the same way as the British felt it across the pond?
Well, certainly the impression from the churches and from the government is that it's a personal war for Canada, that Canada's commitment was to become the leading dominion in the reformation of A, the British Empire, and B, the world. There was a real peculiar form of Christian Canadian nationalism, often called the national gospel, among the Protestant churches. Catholics were more restrained, of course, but they had their own versions too. French Canada had a vision that they would bring French-Canadian Catholicism to North America and maintain a pure ultramontane Catholic vision of the future. Irish Canadians were working towards the idea that in Canada, at least, the British Empire was a vehicle for the realization of God's garden of Catholicism in North America. So all the churches had their own version that featured Canada as a leader in this theological and social reformation, political reformation.
And the unifying force between the religions, you're bringing both together on a crusade for righteousness.
That's right. The hope for church unification among the Protestants was very high, although in the end this is one of the disillusioning factors, because right after the war the Anglicans said in Canada, that's not on. And so the Methodists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists went on to create the United Church of Canada, although Presbyterians for Northern Ireland in the end did not want to join, so we had a continuing Presbyterian church in Canada when it was over. So after the war there was quite a bit of declension or falling away from the original vision.
Yeah.
And the Catholics in particular said, well, what to expect? But among Protestants, there was a wave of disappointment, I think, right after the war.
In the modern epoch, you have sent us the artist, Dr. Licia Troughton. She's in Ireland at the moment with her great work of remembering, her linen wall, her linen memorial, charting all who died in our 40 years conflict in the recent past here in Northern Ireland. There's a significance in that, is there not? There is a resonance with the things we have been talking about.
Absolutely. When I was a boy growing up and as a teenager, hearing about the new troubles beginning and meeting people who'd left Ireland to come to Canada to find a safe place, who'd left Northern Ireland, the battle over the destiny of the Northern Ireland and the involvement of the IRA, and I was also living in Scotland when the Stormont Accords came out. But for a man like me with an Irish mother and a Scottish father, this was my story too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was not neutral,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so many Canadians looked at Ireland and ached over it. And when I met Licia and saw the work she'd done, it really struck a chord, because we still look at the war with a sense of loss and commemoration, and the rituals of remembrance in Canada often means that every little town has a cenotaph, even in the most isolated parts of Canada, and on it are the names of people that sometimes we know.
Yeah, and the thing about the cenotaph, of course, is that almost universally here in Ireland, the cenotaph holds the names of one tradition, of one religion, of one perspective on the issues of life. The thing about the Troughton Memorial is it brings everyone together on the pristine ground of the white linen.
Yes. And so you move into linen, and you're looking at the kinder, gentler, and of course the contributions of women. And in Canada, you'll see that in many ways, but it's not recorded in such a symbolic way. For linen to be used is to bring up the veil of tears, the veil of nurture and care and loss that really comes out of the very heart and bodies of women. And that's there in World War I, but it's replicated now in the Silver Cross Mothers.
And it's taking me back to another cross on a hill in Jerusalem, all those 2,000 years ago. Isn't it amazing that the linen that wrapped the body, the linen that was found in the tomb, is now today the linen that in some measure is uniting people in Northern Ireland after our troubles?
Well, that's where I think we again see that, in my case, watching Ireland, it was the women who led the movement towards peace when the men were bankrupt in some of the darkest days of the 90s. And so we look at that and we realize that with that sensitivity, we have the capacity for peace and unity comes out of the symbols and the recording of every single name in one way and in one place that brings us memories of what sacrifice means. The movement, the mental and spiritual movement of this has not happened as a waste, although tragic loss that it was. It is possible to convert that to reconciliation, to greater unity, and in linen, which is often in handkerchiefs and absorbs so many tears.
Yes,
it also absorbs a lot of blood and creates a network, a matrix, if you want to use a very old-fashioned Roman word, from which common life, common death, common rebirth can occur.
Duff, you are an amazing man with a fantastic insight and clarity of vision in this matter. Thank you very, very much indeed.
And thank you. God bless.
God bless you.